everyone, and welcome. I'm Anjali Dalal Clayton, and I'm an art historian and research fellow at the Decolonising Arts Institute. You can find out more about the Institute by signing up for our newsletter and mailing list at Decolonising Arts Institute at arts.ac.uk. Welcome to the second of the Institute Research Season roundtables under the theme of cultural urgencies, actions towards representation, equity, justice, and well-being. All of these are bookable through our Institute event pages. The Cultural Urgencies roundtables are taking place on Tuesday afternoons throughout March, convened by the Institute's research fellows and associates. We kicked off last week with Decentering Fashion, guest hosted by Professor Shahida Bari, with colleagues from the Cultural and Historical Studies Department at LCF and guests from the V&A. This week, we're focusing on decolonising the university and the role of linguistic diversity, hosted by Dr. Victoria Odeniyi, and I'll hand over to Duna Sabri shortly to introduce Victoria. Next week, on the 16th, Dr. Kairani Baroka will convene a discussion on cultural narratives of interlocking crises, COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. On the 23rd, we'll focus on Roma Lives, Reflections on Art and Visual Culture, hosted by Dr. Iliana Selejan. And the final roundtable on the 30th will explore Curating Black British Arts Now, hosted by myself. So before I hand over to Duna, let me run through some housekeeping reminders. Please be aware that mics and cameras are automatically muted. You can accept live transcript if required. You can post questions and comments to the chat box. You can also use the Q&A box when this is opened for these segments. And please note that the event is being recorded for the Institute's research archive, and selected excerpts may be shared post-research season. So Duna, would you like to introduce Victoria now?
Hello, thank you for inviting me. I had thought I was just introducing a bit about the project that Victoria is leading, as well as Victoria. So if it's all right, I'll just spend 30 seconds doing that. So we have a project called Reimagining Conversations with Multilingual Students. And it really began some sort of 18 months ago now, perhaps, as a conversation between myself and Helen McAllister, who's the Associate Dean for the International Student Experience. I think, Helen, you are here as well. And I think both Helen and I became aware that within UAL and perhaps in higher education more widely, there were very different assumptive worlds operating among multilingual students, among home students whose first language is English, and among academics. And the phrase for me that kind of epitomizes this is that in my own research, I often heard multilingual students say that when they were discussing their work, tutors might sometimes say, "I don't get it. I just don't get it." And for me, that just seemed to typify the way in which anything that we produce in this creative arts university brings something of ourselves into the conversation. And in order to understand that, in order to make sense of it, you have to have some idea of the cultural reference points within that, within which that's being brought forward. And so in order to make sense of it, in order not to start with, "I don't get it," we need prior knowledge, we need curiosity, we need a way of asking questions that really invites a collaboration in order to make sense of that work. And simultaneously, Helen and I were becoming aware of national student survey comments in which students whose apparent first language was English were saying, you know, why are there so many international students here? And we're kind of clearly framing the presence of multilingual students as a kind of encroachment on their educational experience. And we were also simultaneously aware of the work of Constance Lung and Jenny, sorry, I've forgotten her surname now, but and you know, a couple of academics who are really important to us and who are now advisors to the project. And so we wanted a specialist researcher. We were aware that neither of us came from disciplines that could really pursue this. And we wanted somebody who would lead this project. And we were extremely lucky to have Victoria joining us as our postdoctoral fellow on this project. And the first thing she did was reconceptualize and help us reconceptualize the project. We called it Reimagining Conversations with Students with English as a Second Language. And we thought that was quite a neat acronym, it was SEALS. But she helped us work out that it wasn't about English as a second language, because that was still centering English, but rather it was about English students, multilingual students with resources and enrichment that they were bringing to us. So without further ado, I would like to just hand over to Victoria, who has taken this project and transformed it and enacted it in the most trying of possible circumstances over the last 12 months or so. And I'm really looking forward to hearing this roundtable and the framing of it and the questions that we've been pursuing as part of the project.
Thank you very much, Duna. Thank you for that generous introduction. It's great to have this opportunity to discuss these issues. And before I introduce our 6 expert panelists, I would just like to give some, not so much background to the project, because Duna has done that very comprehensively, but just to talk about some common sense beliefs about language which permeate all institutions, including universities. The first is that there is such a version of English which is spoken by English people in England, and this imagined group of people provide the standards for the rest of the world. And because of this view, there's also a view that all migrants to England, to Britain, should learn English in order to integrate. Another way of thinking about language is that some languages, Greek, Latin, English, French, are better suited for educational purposes than other languages. And therefore it follows that people who speak non-standard English, Black English, multilingual London English, Scouse, Brummie, Indian English, for example, or indeed any regional, social or post-colonial way of speaking in English, are sometimes perceived as less able academically. From this perspective, language diversity in the academy is seen as a problem to be fixed. Yet this contrasts with the way in which the world is today. For most people globally, the use of more than one language or more than one language variety are everyday parts of our everyday routine practice and aspects of life. This is what people do. People work, research, think, create, and socialize in languages which are important to them. At the same time, there's been an increase in linguistic diversity within global universities around the world in the last 25 years or so. And although what the multilingual is and has been and is understood differently in different contexts, there are calls to engage and understand what repertoires students bring. The Kenyan scholar Ngugi wa Thiong'o, citing Spivak, argues for the visibility of the subaltern languages, non-European languages in post-colonial contexts. And therefore we need to explore the role of language in the Decolonising the University movement and initiatives that so many people are engaged in at UAL. Increasing the visibility of linguistic diversity promotes the idea of a multilingual institution, and where, I quote van der Waals, students using the languages they know and those they are getting to know are enabled to succeed. And therefore we can begin to think about how central languages to conversations and debates around diversity, difference, and equality. Today's panelists present different perspectives on various aspects of linguistic diversity and inclusion in the university. First of all, Alex Ding is Director of Scholarship and Director of the Centre of Excellence for Language Teaching in the School of Languages, Cultures and Societies at the University of Leeds. He's an Associate Professor of English for Academic Purposes and regularly examines PhD students from around the world. He's currently editing a book on social theory and English for academic purposes. And I became of the relevance of Alex's substantive work interrogating socio-political issues around language and professional identities of English for academic purposes practitioners during the pandemic early last year. Secondly, Oka Okabarani is a writer, artist and translator and researcher from Jakarta, based in London. She is currently an associate artist at the National Centre for Writing, research fellow at the university's Decolonising Arts Institute, and a board member of Shadow Heroes, an organisation which runs workshops for schools and universities to promote the power of translation and linguistic dexterity. I know Oka through our work and collaboration with the Decolonising Arts Institute. Ila Isatalis works in the field of intercultural training and has run her own successful consultancy, Unidos Oi, for over 15 years. She's worked extensively in the private, public and third sectors. Ila has an interest in anti-racist and inclusive pedagogy and recently gave a seminar for the European branch of the Society for Intercultural Education, Training and Research, their anti-racist learning series. She's currently undertaking her doctorate at the University of Fribourg, based on her ethnographic fieldwork at an asylum centre. I met Ila in 2016 in London when she attended a seminar on the road to becoming called The Road to Becoming a Critical Interculturalist, and I've since attended conferences in Helsinki. Tim Stevens is an educational developer at the University of Arts with an interest in the curriculum and educational ethics. He works for the Teaching and Learning and Employability Exchange at the university and is also a photographic artist with over 30 years of experience working in education with learners, artists and lecturers. I've known Tim for 4 months, but became aware of the relevance of his work for linguistic diversity through an article he authored called Academic Speech Therapy in 2019. Dr. Gillian Lazar is a senior lecturer in the Department of Education at Middlesex University. She has taught and supervised dissertations on the MA TESOL and Applied Linguistics programme there and is a member of the British Association of Applied Linguistics. Gillian has spoken on using literature in language teaching, figurative language and academic literacies at conferences and teaching associations around the world. Gillian and I have worked, collaborated and published together for over 20 years. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Mark Ingham. Mark is a reader in critical and nomadic pedagogies at UAL. Mark is the Teaching and Learning Innovation Lead in the Design School at London College of Communication. His pedagogical and creative research interests are entangled encounters with images of thought and memory, rhizomatic and metacognitive learning theories, fuzzy narratives, and virtual and physical liminal teaching spaces. Mark is one of the few colleagues at UAL who I have actually met in person because of the pandemic, and I've been inspired and excited by his cutting-edge project, Becoming Lost and Found in Translation. I would now like to hand over to Dr. Alex Ding, who will talk about language, politics, and the university.
Thank you, Victoria. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. Yep, great. I'd like to say thank you to Victoria and the organisers for inviting me. Victoria will remember that I did have to double check that she got the right person for me in this event. My work isn't really around decolonisation, but as Victoria suggested, more around the politics of the work I do. So forgive me if my comments are perhaps less informed than the other panelists. So I'm going to start by saying that my comments on decolonisation are fragmented. They're somewhat disjointed, a little bit incoherent, and discontinuous. They are more sort of aphoristic, really, rather than a fluent, coherent, and persuasive narrative. And the reason why I say this is perhaps this is a reflection of what Bourdieu might call a cleft habitus, where conditions of existence change so dramatically that dispositions lose coherence, entailing a sense of dislocation and internal division. And what I mean by that is, this is a kind of consequence of working now for a year in very extraordinary conditions and circumstances. It's years of working in an avaricious neoliberal university system, and it's combined with years of working as an English for academic purposes practitioner, where I work in a liminal field, working within a field that has very ambivalent goals and ambitions, and also structured. This field is structured within the academic arena, where there is little kind of intellectual or academic capital, but plenty of economic capital. So this kind of fractured, disjointed sense is a career history in my relationship to the university. It's to do with neoliberalism, and it's to do with all of the structural issues that have emerged in the last year, not around coronavirus. So that's kind of, I'm performing this kind of fragmented self, I think, so apologies for that. The question of decolonisation really, for me, is very difficult to distill or extract from the frankly toxic nexus of political and media rhetoric, where decolonisation is enmeshed in poisonous tropes of identity politics, willful and harmful attempts of the government to distort and manipulate discourses of decolonisation, amongst other things, through, and I think this is rather ironically, rewriting history, evoking free speech, using terms such as wokeness, call-out culture, no platforming, being divisive, talking about Mickey Mouse degrees, value for money, and so on. So the question for me of decolonisation, it exists within a particularly potent and toxic public discourse around universities generally. The next point I want to make around decolonisation is that it's been around for a very long time. So I think we need to ask the question, sociologically speaking, why has it now become so pressing? Why now? The obvious answer is Black Lives Matter, of course, but also I think there is a compendium of factors. I think growing angst, anxiety, and anger around issues within and beyond higher education to do with race, commodification, inclusion, gender, representation, purposes of higher education, pay and precarity. So in a sense, decolonisation perhaps is, if you like, the visible part of a growing range of issues that sort of exemplify a highly political and politicised moment in higher education history, where very existential questions around what we do and who we teach, the language we use, have become dominant. So I want to start the next part by confronting firstly some of the cynicism over decolonisation, and perhaps by doing that begin to sort of see how we can overcome it. My first kind of peripheral reading of decolonisation today, just to see what was in the media. If you look at the Times Higher Education Supplement, my first thought was it won't be long before the THS as a ranking for decolonisation, a kind of black tie champagne celebration, which is using the kind of employing the destructive metrics and measurements that they use to commodify and rank institutions. So there will be some celebratory event that will enable marketing departments and universities to seize upon this, to sell their university, or if universities do badly, allow university leaders to berate their colleagues. So the first issue around decolonisation is it will become, in my view, something that we can also measure and use metrics around, which some would argue is a colonial method in itself. So if and when decolonisation becomes mainstream, it will be marketed, it will be credentialised, it will be unbundled, it will be packaged, digitised and sold. At the same time, it's becoming diluted, distilled and possibly forgotten. Decolonisation has already been cynically evoked by the University of Leicester to try and force through redundancies by what they euphemistically call restructuring. So there's a lot of kind of concern for me around the purposes that decolonisation could be used for. But for me, decolonisation on a very, very simple and very simplistic level relies perhaps on old-fashioned notions of truth and objectivity for its force. It relies on evidential force to recalibrate, rethink, reassess the canons, knowledge, pedagogies that permeate the university. I cannot see what is controversial about critically rethinking the university through decolonial eyes. This is where language for me comes in my role, if you like, in English for academic purposes. English for academic purposes has a troubled relationship with language, power and politics. Tensions between acculturation of students into disciplinary practices, serving disciplines on the one hand, and on the other, which is a false binary in my view, a more critical approach that engenders language choice, student rights, all within a transformative agenda. This binary, which is comfortable for protagonists on both sides perhaps, is, in my view, no longer sustainable. It's a tired trope that helps nobody, least of all students. As a profession, there is basically no shared explicit values to draw on, no agreed knowledge base, and no consistency around roles of what my profession does. Yet EAP should be making language visible. B. Bond wrote an excellent book around this, where language is practices that impact students, that have real effect on them and their lives, need to be made visible. In other words, EAP has a role to inform, advocate and participate in language education more broadly than simply within the classroom. In policies, practices and pedagogies across the university, this is where language educators need to be making impact. The tired "We Are International" hashtag and banner that greets students usually means a monolingual university, not a plurilingual university. And EAP participates in that fully. EAP needs to foster much, much more the idea of a plurilingual university, and we should see our roles as supporting all languages. After all, we are all language educators. So EAP needs to do much more in its advocacy of other languages and other practices around language within the university. So what I think we need is, or what I need perhaps, is activist scholarship, which is subjective engagement and action within decolonisation and other political acts within university. But this needs to be combined with a scholarship of activism. This is a distanced step where it entails critique and certain objectivity. So activist scholarship and scholarship of activism. Both are needed, in my view, to remain humble, open and receptive to errors. After all, decolonising the curriculum may entail unforeseen eventualities that we need to be cautious of and need to be concerned about where our actions lead us. So having both activist scholarship and a scholarship of activism requires trust and solidarity between all actors in the university. And it needs to be part of a far larger project to rethink and remake universities that become a place where lived experience, that much used trope, is not the end point, but the starting point of an unsettling, opening and rich multilingual education. And on that note, I stop.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex. That was very thought-provoking, and you've raised lots of important questions. I would now like to pass over to our second speaker, Barani, who will talk about deaf and disabled languages and cultures in education.
Hi, thank you so much, Victoria, for convening this and for the work you do, and thank you to the other presenters as well. So, as a disabled person, I would like to invite you to consider the working definition of ableism by Talila T.L. Lewis, who is also one of our speakers for next week's roundtable. Ableism, a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on socially constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, and excellence. These constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, and excellence are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on people's appearance and/or their ability to satisfactorily produce, excel, and quote-unquote behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. I would add to Talila's definition that these constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, and excellence, apart from being rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, and capitalism, are also deeply entwined with the word colonialism that ties all of those things together. As an Indigenous person, I find myself very drawn to Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang's definition of decolonization as something that brings about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. It is not a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. In education, whether in higher education, grade school level, or any kind of education really, this idea of what constitutes excellence and normalcy separates deaf and disabled languages and cultures as not being cultures often. It's seen as, oh, you need to see a health person, or you need to go to your access center, right? It's seen as impairment rather than the fact that there are, disabled people are the largest minority in the world, and there are so many deaf cultures just within the UK. A person who signs from London will sign differently from someone from Manchester, for instance. In Indonesia, where I'm from, the national sign language is called Bisindo, but there is also a sign language called Katakolak, which originates from just one village in Bali, where there is a preponderance of deaf people. So even within speaking about, sign language interpretation within a university, for instance, there are power dynamics. Which sign languages do you use? And why and how, and budgeting, right? And allocation of staff and resources, all of this is political. And all of this is very much entwined with what is considered appropriate language, or a language that can be measured in colonial metrics, as Dr. Ding mentioned, right? The artist who's passed away, unfortunately, Mel Bagg's video In My Language, uses the word translation quite prominently to convey the discrepancy between how people perceive Mel's communication as an autistic person and what Mel is actually conveying. And I quote from that video, "We are even viewed as non-communicative if we don't speak the standard language, but other people are not considered non-communicative if they are so oblivious to our own languages, in this case autistic languages, as to believe they don't exist. And in a world in which those determine whether you have any rights, there are people being tortured, people dying because they're considered non-persons, because their kind of thought is so unusual as to not be considered thought at all. Within universities, what kind of languages do we not even believe exist? And how is that informed by how our individual body minds work? And how, as a university, can we embrace the multisensorial and the sheer diversity of deaf and disabled languages to understand that there are so many pluriform forms of thought that are often considered not thought at all? I mentioned that I'm Indonesian. My cultures are Minangkabau or Minang and Javanese. And just within Javanese culture, for instance, we have disabled gods. But along with Dutch missionary medicine, which is a topic that my colleague Slamet Amix Tohari has written about, with the preponderance of missionary medical hospitals, the model of disability, and there are, theoretically, there are many, many different models of disability that we could spend ages talking about and dissecting. And I encourage people within higher education to really examine those models and promote discussion of them. The indigenous models of disability as being closer to gods, as having an extra sensitivity to the spiritual, was almost completely wiped out and erased in favor of the medical model of disability, in which if you are non-normative, you are to be cured. And what is non-normative about you is to be eliminated. And often, as we see in the United Kingdom, in the wake of a pandemic in which about at least 60% of those who have passed away are disabled people, and in a country in which even before the pandemic, the United Nations declared an emergency of human rights for disabled people due to austerity measures, we have to examine how exclusion of languages and cultures, including deaf and disabled languages, that is so prevalent and endemic in the university system is part and parcel of this eugenics, is part and parcel of a literal massacre, and there's no other way to describe that. So understanding disability as not just, identitarian or a matter of access in a very technocratic view, but rather understanding undoing ableisms and assumptive ableisms in particular, always I assume a person is disabled until told otherwise, because visual cultures, which is my research focus for the past decade, has been how colonial visual cultures have trained us to assume that a person is quote unquote abled until proven otherwise. And this is something we actively need to undo, particularly at UAL as a university dealing with visual cultures. That is part and parcel of decolonization, because ableism is colonialism and colonialism is ableism. And it is all tied up with notions of what constitutes a good body. And all of that is, of course, very much tied up with racisms. So we need to understand these as not separate. There is a tendency to portray deaf and disabled cultures as very much through a white privileged lens, which is why I really appreciate Talila Lewis's definition, because in the United Kingdom, studies show that although the people most likely to declare disability are Caucasian, the people who are most likely to be disabled are South Asian British, and the people who are most likely to be negatively impacted by being disabled are Black people within the United Kingdom. So we really have to examine how racisms and ableisms intertwine and rework our curricula in order to not only include, but to examine the violences that have historically happened. This is not a new thing that the university is becoming politicized. It has always been political, it has always been exclusionary, and there have always been violences committed against students and staff and faculty members who are from deaf and disabled communities. So with that, could you please remind me of the scholar who defined ableism? Talila Lewis, and Talila will also be speaking at our roundtable next week. And the main political hurdles on decolonizing university or education and implementing Indigenous languaging, that will, there are so many discussions that we could have about that. And I'm looking forward to hearing other speakers take on this topic as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Oka. I think the questions you raise are so powerful and so important. What constitutes normalcy and ableism? Thank you. I would like to now pass over to Ila Isotalus, who will explore linguistic diversity from the perspective of officially bilingual Finland, by looking at the university on the one hand and the asylum centre on the other. She will present the policies of different multilingual practices and reflect on their impacts on learning and social equality.
Thank you, Victoria. First, I want to thank for inviting me here. I consider these kind of discussions extremely important in order to advance the social change in academy as such. As Victoria referred, I'll talk about Finnish case. To start with, Finland has two national languages, Finnish and Swedish, and their speakers are far from being of equal proportions, as more than 87% are Finnish speakers and around 5% Swedish speakers. Having two national languages means that people speaking Finnish and Swedish have, on the base of the law, equal rights to access public services in their own mother tongue, including education. So we have parallel educational systems in Finnish and in Swedish from kindergarten to universities. University of Helsinki, where I have worked also, has a trilingual policy, which means that all of the official information should be circulated in three languages, Finnish, Swedish, and English. And even though there are separate universities which do operate mainly in Swedish, the University of Helsinki has also one department, Social- och kommunalhögskola. There are also Swedish-speaking positions of professorships or lectures, aiming specifically to serve Swedish speakers, to make sure that they also have the possibility to the supervision, lectures, peer groups, etc., in their own mother tongue. To take the Department of Education as an example, I started my PhD studies there, and my supervisor was in such a position in Swedish-speaking professorship. Our linguistic practices included, when we met for supervision, we were actually talking in English. Why so? My Swedish is good enough to chat, also maybe to read academic papers, maybe even to write. But to discuss about my academic paper in academic terms is not possible. And what comes to my supervisor, she can speak Finnish as well, but for her it was the same. It was easier to discuss in academic terms in English than in Finnish. Also the fact that I was writing in English anyways, because my other supervisor is from University College London. Our email exchanges were, depending on the content or maybe the mood or available time, in any of these three languages. When we had a seminar, people of our group presented their papers written in Swedish, Finnish, or English. In principle, the idea was that we speak the language paper is written on, but in practice, it happened that, for example, my paper was written in English, but in the seminar, we recognized that everybody in the group was Finnish speaking, except the supervisor. We decided to discuss in Finnish. And to discussion in the seminar, whatever language of these three we used for discussion, it was always possible to comment, ask, or answer questions in any of these three languages. So, for example, when we discussed my paper in Finnish, my supervisor commented in Swedish. Obviously, this can only work knowing that everybody in the group speaks to a certain extent all these languages. But it's also recognizing the fact that our language skills are partial and often differ in active and passive use of language, meaning that it is often easier to read and write than it is to talk and listen. In the discussion, participation is immediate, so you don't have a lot of time to think or formulate your comments. So if you know the language well, you are faster to respond. So it's also a question of equality in that sense. Using all the common linguistic resources we had increases possibilities to equal participation. When I was teaching at the university, I had quite multilingual groups, and I explicitly accepted written assignments in all the languages I can read. I could not give, for instance, lecture in all these languages, but I can read, and I also wanted to take a challenge, knowing that I can get some help from my colleagues if needed. There is a problem, though. many problems actually, but I concentrate on one. The examples show as well that this linguistic repertoire, even though maybe wide, in my case, they were like, I could take essays, Finnish and Swedish, English, Spanish and Portuguese, and in German and French. It's quite many languages, but they are all European languages. Obviously, because of colonization, of prestige of languages, etc. Many of these languages are spoken outside of Europe and, for example, Asia. Like if I would have Russian, Chinese, Indian student as well, which I did, that did not change their situation at all. I was not able to give them a chance to write in their mother tongue. I'm not saying that every teacher should know all the languages of the students, obviously not. It's not possible and it's something I'm looking for. Just want to point out that when we give these opportunities, it's also restricted to certain groups unless we have better representation among the teachers and professors. For example, in Britain, there is a big number of students from Asia, specifically from China. And actually that is also the case in Aalto University, where I worked as well. So the question is very much also, how much do we have representation of these groups where students come from in our staff? Then another example, could you please now put the picture of the winter event, the slide on. As Victoria already referred, I did my ethnographic fieldwork in an asylum center. The majority of people living there were from Iraq, and then there were smaller groups from Somalia, Afghanistan, single persons from Africa, and by the end of my fieldwork came some people from Russia. There were big differences between these groups when it comes to language learning and linguistic resources. Some were highly educated and knew English already, or at least had learning tools ready. Others had never had opportunity to go to school. We didn't have, or there were no shared language as such. It sounds complicated, and it is as well. Life in the Center is an excellent example where all the possible linguistic resources were in use. The picture you see is an ad of one winter event organized for residents. It includes text in English and Finnish and pictures showing the activities planned. We had actually some resources also to the languages of the residents. There were workers, 2 workers who knew Arabic and 1 who knew Farsi, the Sorani. And then, but it was very accidental if they were really used there. But in generally, the communications very much ad hoc. But everybody used all the possible common words one knew: hands, self-made sign language, Google translated pictures and other visuals, like showing, pointing out fingers, etc. Obviously, this kind of scarce shared linguistic resources limits topics one can talk about. But it was interesting to recognize what people learned from each other, what they picked up from discussions, residents in Finnish and the workers in Arabic, in Somali, in Dari, huomenta, miten menet, turi, good morning, how are you today? And that shows what language is for connection. It's not only that we need to transmit a message to someone, but maybe even more, especially in that context. We need to contact, we need to feel that we are seen, we are accepted, we belong, etc. And these kind of things you can do with very small common linguistic resources. And even though you would say that in your own language, like good morning, everybody would have understood in that situation when one sees for the first time for that day. But learning it in others' language, new to you, highlights that one has made an effort, even if it is small, but still it is something. It shows positive attitude towards the language, but even more importantly, towards the person and group, which in the context of Asylum Center has exceptionally deep meaning. So maybe this from the center shows a lot about what, or kind of provokes us to discuss and talk also, what are the functions of language? What do we need the language for? Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. It was great to hear about your experiences of negotiating so many different languages in your repertoire. And one point that stood out for me is when you said that we need better representation amongst teachers. I would now like to hand over to Mark, who will introduce English as a lingua franca and introduce his project, Becoming Lost and Found in Translation. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you for the kind words, and thank you for all the other speakers. You put me right in the middle, which is quite interesting, and I'm going to try an experiment, which is essentially a series of questions which leads up to the project that Victoria says. So, and there are a series of quotes which I'm trying to unpack, and it's a bit of an experiment. I don't know whether it will work or not. It's a bit of a stuttering and a stammering. So I'm going to start off with something quite provocative, which comes from Robert Phillipson's idea that in fact English is not a lingua franca at all, but possibly could be seen as a lingua frankensteiner. And I put the destroyer of worlds because I thought I might as well be more provocative than perhaps he is. So the quote comes from this place here, which I'm going to put in the chat if I can work this properly. I like the chat in these things. I use a lot with students, especially students who are invisible. So if you want to start to work against the chat and destroy it in some way, I'm very happy to do that one. So as I say, this is a series of quotes leading up to something which I don't quite know what will be. So that has led me, this invitation, Victoria, has been so stimulating that I might overdo this talk completely. So apologize to start with. So it may be these series of quotes may resonate, may not, may irritate. That's absolutely fine. But what I want to do is to say, is actually what we're looking at something a bit like the thing in Red Dragon. I don't know if you know Red Dragon, a film and a book by, I think, by Richard Harris, where the detective is trying to work out what the problem is. And he realizes after a while the problem is he's looking at a series of photographs or a series of film. He realizes the problem or the clue to the reason is actually the photograph and the film itself. And I just wonder sometimes whether we actually are avoiding the issue in terms of language. Perhaps we're not. Perhaps we really are deciding that English is the issue. So I've just been doing quite a bit of work about Indigenous languages and finding out what happens with those languages. So there's a linguicide going on in the world, a slow linguicide, if you like, and it's been going on for obviously quite a long time. But in 2019, the UAN said out of the 7,000 Indigenous languages, 4 in 10 are in danger of disappearing. And mainly that's to do with the colonialization of languages, language being a colonizing force, a destroying force. Okay, so that was almost the end of a piece of research I did about translation, which is what my project is about, because I realized I was being super liberal about it, thinking, I think about, like Alex was saying, that brilliant, we were involved in translation, we're internationalizing everything, when I realized that this was actually still a part of the colonial force. If anybody knows me quite well, and you can probably guess from my title, is that I'm quite interested in the works of Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. And I'm quite interested in his ideas and their ideas of language. And I think partly I'm interested in that because I'm dyslexic, and I'm very heavily dyslexic. And recently I wrote a piece of a writing called Being Dyslexic, and it's the first time in public I've said that. And I think that's why I've always been really interested in language. I teach dissertations, thesis at BA level, 12 PhD students. So I have quite an interest in language, also in language that sometimes stutters and stammers, that doesn't quite get there. So I'm also quite interested in the fact that when someone says the word dyslexic, whatever that means, it's totally contestable. You either have this idea of sort of sympathy, or that we can see around corners. We have some special power in art and design. I'm an artist, I'm a sculptor, so therefore I can see spatially much better. This is a patently load of nonsense. So I'm quite interested in to see how we can get away from the actual problem itself, which for me, in terms of academic writing, is the academic writing itself, is the essay, a dissertation. Victoria gave a really interesting talk last week at the Institute of Education, where she talked about the idea of the academic essay being this sort of rigid thing. And I can't believe that it's still in this form. I've been trying for years and years and years to break out of this form, so to become much more creative, interesting, inclusive practice with full of different types of languages, visual and otherwise. But it still sticks, and I'm still quite curious to know why that still sticks. So I'm quite interested in Deleuze's idea and Guattari's idea of the idea of stuttering. And what they're talking about is not in the sense of a speech stuttering, but in the sense of language stuttering. Because I think what that enables you to do philosophically is making language vibrate and do something and destabilizes it. And I think that's what we probably need to do in the terms of decolonization, is destabilize what is actually obviously there. We can't move on unless we get rid of something, but perhaps we also need to think about it. I'm being slightly provocative here, and I don't know quite what I'm talking about in terms of linguistics. So I'm sure there will be some other comments on that. These quotes are just for sort of reference, but they also just show perhaps where my thinking, and perhaps my thinking of it is not quite there. Right, so there's some bits about stuttering stammering. I just want to also get on about the power of language. And I think there's a paradox. I'm a great believer in the fact that we should teach and learn about language. There's a move in, especially in UK universities, to get rid of the idea of the dissertation and the thesis at the end of certainly undergraduate level, which I think is a complete disaster. It may seem a paradox. There was a piece of research done recently at UAL which started off with the idea that it was the dissertation, the thesis, the written element of our undergraduate BA art and design course that was creating the awarding gaps. Actually, the research didn't show that at all, which was quite surprising to the researchers. In fact, it showed something else, that there were awarding gaps in some other places. So sometimes what we think is the problem is not. So I'm quite interested in still being able to give people power in terms of language, in terms of voice, and not take bits away. And so you don't need to do that. You can get on with your sculpture within your studio. There's a very long quote coming up, so I apologize for these long quotes. I don't know whether this is working at all. This may be just deeply irritating, which is about the idea of, I'm not copying, pasting, sorry about this. This is my stammering, I'm afraid. This is my stuttering. Okay, I'm going to move on. I'm not being able to do that one. The Lost and Found in Translation project, which Victoria mentioned earlier on, is basically a project that I'm doing with a series of students and staff at LCC, which is about the idea of bringing everybody into the world of translation. If you go to the Padlet, if anybody wants to do that in the audience, I'll be very happy for you to do that and actually start to use that interactive tool to be able to start to put some of your ideas into that. And this has become sort of quite an interesting ongoing project that also has an Instagram element to it. But as I said right at the beginning, I think that although this is Victoria said it was a cutting edge project, it may well be cutting edge in some ways, but I also think it starts to open up a whole series of thinking and thoughts about how language is used, which a lot of the other speakers I think more articulately have described. It's asked a series of questions, which I don't know whether they're the right questions. So perhaps I'll ask the audience to think about, am I asking the right questions, or should we think about what other questions might be asked instead, so that we can elicit some sort of idea of discourse around those things. I didn't put my clock on, but I'm just going to end with a couple of things. One is the idea that there is no such thing as a mother tongue. And that we are, in a sense, basically a series of other types of languages and that the dominant language will always crush other things. But I'd quite like to end just quickly with something that I've always loved, which is from Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, which talks about the idea, I don't know if anybody knows this book, which talks about the idea when before two people can speak to each other, somehow they perform language in a certain way. So this is all about the idea that Marco Polo, talking to Kubla Khan, talks in a series of performances, and a series of barkings, and a series of hootings, and a series of objects, and a series of performances, and a series of things. And what I really loved about those passages was that actually that was the point where real communication started to happen, rather than when actually Marco Polo started to speak the language of Kubla Khan. So perhaps what I'm going right back to the beginning, to be provocative, is English the problem? Well, we might all agree English may be a problem, but is that actually something that we really need to look at? And perhaps even more importantly, is language the problem? I'll end there.
Thank you, Mark.
Sorry about that. It was all a bit, it was all beautifully rehearsed and it went horribly wrong. But anyway.
No, it didn't. It didn't. It was really, and I think I'm pleased that you were one of the middle speakers, because we've had this refreshing kind of creative interlude. Thank you so much.
That's okay. It's a pleasure.
And I'm going to think about whether there is such a thing as a mother tongue. Thank you. Now I'd like to hand over to Tim Stevens, who will talk about his practice as a tutor.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you, everybody. It's nice to be here, and I hope you can hear me okay. So I've given a title to this talk, which is Reminiscence, Depatriation, Obsolete. And it's a story about me being a tutor of various kinds. And it addresses one of the questions that we were given before the panel, perhaps more than others. How can we begin to make visible the multilingual repertoires of our students and colleagues, and for which creative purpose? So I started teaching in 1986, mid-1980s in Newham in the East End of London. And my line manager put Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed in my hands and said, off you go. So I started teaching adult literacy. And some of the other strands that I was working with at the time, I think on reflection, haven't changed that much. So I was teaching creative writing. I was a tutor of what was called essential adult learning at the time, or life skills. But they fall perhaps now under self-regulation, metacognition, that sort of thing, study skills. I was working with people who had come out of long stay institutions. And I was working with forced migrants or people who were new to the community, often coming from conflict situations. But definitely people who had migrated and had that experience of a different childhood home. Then by the late 80s, early 90s, I was working on a street called Green Street in Forest Gate in Newham, which I think is emblematic of a kind of multicultural education at that time. And in the Adult Education Centre, I was a coordinator of a language kind of drop-in centre set up. And the mix of people in the room would be, I mean, there was white British working class people associated with the south of Newham, have a history of employment with the docks. There were Jewish migrants that had moved, years before and migrated out of the city more into the suburbs. There were East African, Asian communities, Bangladeshi community. And there were even people from Vietnam, from that first wave of refugees, and then a big Somali community because of the war in northern Somaliland in the early 90s. But I was also interested in the work with that first wave of migrants from the 1950s from the Caribbean. And there were some successes, I think, of the work that we were doing at that time. What I think, we were basically self-publishers. We were writing life stories. If someone spoke about what they were doing that day, making bread, you know, I'd encourage them. Sometimes people didn't need much encouragement to share their recipe. And suddenly we'd have 5 recipes and 5 ways of making bread around the table, and could end up eating bread the next week and producing a small book on recipes that we'd share the week after. So whilst we were also photocopier engineers, we were self-publishers in a network of publishing houses, I think, at that time, places like Centerprise in Hackney, in Tower Hamlets, in Brick Lane, in the Newham Parent Centre, where we were working with community publishers that could publish and produce life stories quite quickly, and also decolonize the curriculum in the sense that if we wanted a publication on Marcus Garvey or Nanny of the Maroons, if we couldn't find one, we could make one. And that was very interesting. Another interesting thing, I think, was we had a visit from someone from the Language and Literacy Unit, which was an Inner London Education Authority project, a person by the name of Fufu Savitsky, who was promoting a language histories approach. And she's had an interest in Caribbean language and literature, and helped us to unpack the differences between Creole, Patois, dialect. And for someone interested in Linton Kwesi Johnson and Michael Smith and people who came out of that spoken word poetry dub culture, this was very interesting for students. And basically the idea was to produce for each person, and it was interesting to do this in a systematic way for a couple of years, their language, their own personalized language history. The way that through intermarriage, through moving, their parents, grandparents had certain forms of language, and the combinations of which were unique to them. And the sheer depth and breadth of this linguistic diversity was amazing once it became more brought into the room. And you realized also the varied kinds of knowledge that these dialects and languages were attached to, and culturally how deep those roots were, and the basis of lots of the oral traditions, lots of voices and rhythms of those traditions. But there were a couple of key weaknesses, I think, and real problems that I noticed in teaching at that time. One was this tendency in myself and in colleagues to over-specialize and identify problems and then develop specialized resources, which kind of fragmented and fractured the provision. And this was also one of the effects of having formal curricula and assessment criteria that also did the same. So they decontextualized to the extent that we were really creating performances for iterating failure. And I think the other problem was language itself, which was that I was a talking teacher and I spoke over silences. So I was talking too much and too fluently. I was using my fluency with speech to talk about and promote language, and actually that's counterproductive. Then what happened was that I had an experience that completely exceeded my ability to process it in language. It was something for the first time I couldn't write about. I couldn't write fiction, poetry about it. I couldn't talk about it. So I got myself an artist studio and I sat there and worked out what to do. And this was really probably the most fruitful investigation of language theory at the time, finding a way out of that situation. In coming out of that situation, I worked with students silenced differently, and students who were silent, and students who didn't use English. So deaf students students using speech synthesizers, dyslexic students, and artists, people who had a unique or tangential or specific relationship with language. And I totally agree with Mark that some of the best dissertations I've worked with have been with dyslexic student sensitivity with writing, because automaticity is a problem in language processing, I think. So when I asked my PG Cert tutors, can they define the difference between emotion and feeling? Quite often people are puzzled. They don't readily come up with a definition. So whilst we have Bloom's taxonomy that differentiates a very specialized language of cognitive knowledge, we as teachers today and then find it difficult to articulate feeling. So how can we have student pedagogy, student-centered pedagogy, experiential learning, inclusive pedagogy, and decolonizing the curriculum if we can't define the basic difference between emotion and feeling? So I'd like to end with free air. And the quote that was re-quoted by a friend of his, so Bell Hooks, in the Teaching to Transgress at the front in her dedication. And she quoted him as saying, "We must refuse to bureaucratize the mind." And I think this is a really direct way of asking that question about what language does to us and what we do with language. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim, for sharing your life and your professional experiences. You've given a texture to the east of London. That was very interesting. And you have kept to time as well. That's great. So now I would like to pass over to our last panelist, Gillian Lazar, Dr. Gillian Lazar, who will talk about practical pedagogical interventions relating to the themes of multilingualism and decolonizing the curriculum. Welcome, Gillian.
So thank you very much. It's been lovely to be invited and just fascinating to hear all the talks from the previous panelists. I'm going to talk from the practical perspective of a practitioner who's an applied linguist and who's also working on a postgraduate certificate in higher education. And I'd like to begin by simply recounting an episode from the chalk face, which happened to me about 8 or 9 years ago when I was working on an undergraduate course at a London university, a post-92, in which many of the students were the first people in their family to go to university or came from a British-born minority ethnic background. Now, the students were on a module, on a linguistics program, in which they had to design, teach, or evaluate a language lesson. And this was traditionally done in English, talking to their peers, in other words, micro-teaching English to their peers. And I think the idea was that doing it in English was important because English is a marketable skill, which obviously gives people employability. When I began this module, I realized that actually this micro-teaching practice was deeply uninteresting. First of all the students already spoke English, and therefore the learning gain from doing it was minimal. And so what we decided to do was to upend the way the module was being taught and to upend the micro-teaching so that all the students were able to use another language in the micro-teaching should they wish. And all in all, we had about 12 languages which were then taught in the classroom. And these were languages linked in the past to colonial empires, so English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. There were languages by European students who were international students in Britain, so Greek, German, and Japanese as well. And then most interestingly, we had languages being taught that were spoken by British-born students with their friends and their family, including Urdu, Bengali, Cypriot Turkish, and Arabic. And I can honestly say that by upending this so that language was brought to the forefront of what the students were doing, there was a kind of electrifying effect in the classroom because it was so much more of an engaged and interesting place. And there were a number of very, very interesting things that arose from this. First of all, doing this focused very close attention on the full panoply of semiotic resources that the students had to use in order to communicate with each other. And I was thinking about this, Isla, when you were describing the migrant center. Students had to use real objects, they had to use visuals, they had to use gestures, they had to use facial expressions to really engage with the meanings they were trying to communicate. Another fascinating side effect of this was this flattened hierarchies around which languages had higher status, in that all languages were then afforded equal status as objects of study, with speakers of that language becoming the expert informant. And as you can imagine, the result was that this partially flattened the power dynamics between me and the students, because as the privileged speaker of a standard variety of global English, which is what I am, this meant that I was put in the very small position of taking a risk. What Alison Phipps in her book Decolonising Multilingualism has said about a threshold which needs to be crossed into something which is not knowable. So the decolonizing is the changing of the relationships of power, control, and dependency. And I suppose the question I would ask is, if we are monolingual, or if we are speakers of English, of standard British English, what risk are we going to be taking in our classroom to make that step into the unknown? So what I would like to draw out of this classroom episode, and I completely recognize that, of course, talking about language on a linguistics course is what you would expect. But what I would like to take from this episode is really a question about whether we can make multilingualism central to our curriculum. And I'd just like to kind of share a slide here with you to make this point a little bit clearer. If we think about multilingualism as curricular concepts, sorry, I'm getting a bit muddled here. As you can see my slides, this is what I'll be showing you. If we make multilingualism curricular content, then maybe we're in a space where there can be a series of imaginative what ifs. So, and here this is very, very speculative, because of course these are disciplines I haven't taught and I know nothing about. But what if you're a fashion lecturer and, drawing on the work of Catherine Hammett's t-shirts, you get all your students to design a garment which reflects a slogan in the language of their choice? And what if, as an accompaniment to that project, they have to make a podcast, possibly a bilingual podcast, both in the language of the slogan as well as in English, explaining the choice of that slogan? And we might be mindful here that we have the right to use words in some contexts, but in many countries, those words are silenced. So might the slogan be some sort of blank emptiness, which is then filled with the activists who want to make meaning out of it? What if you were teaching on an animation or video or film course, and the starting point was asking your students to view the video by Zeinab Sideri at Tate Britain, in which the artist, her mother and her daughter try to exchange memories in English, French and Arabic across linguistic divides? Could the students be asked then to devise an artwork around the theme of mother tongue, enabling them not only perhaps to celebrate linguistic diversity, but also to examine issues of power, domination, and erasure? And here I would add that I'm not just speaking about language in terms of nationally defined linguistic phenomenon, but also the code switching that we all do in our everyday lives when we're switching from formal to informal and so on. So those are some possible what-ifs about multilingualism being made visible in terms of curricular content. But what about multilingualism being made visible in terms of curricular process? And here I would very much allude to all the work that's being done by sociolinguists, both in this country and in many other places, around the notion of multilingualism. And I'm thinking here particularly of ethnographic studies, which are mentioned on my final slide, in which people such as Priest, Andrews and Fay and so on in this country have looked at the ways in which university students who speak other languages have used their own languages to summarize and translate course content, to devise glossaries, and to form study groups in which translanguaging, that is moving from one language to another, is absolutely the norm. And I think, again, Isla gave us a kind of example of how that works. I'm also thinking about the work that's being done in South Africa post-apartheid. And of course, I recognize this is a different situation to this country. But I think that a lot of this work is also recognizing that sometimes we need to deliberately design our classrooms so that the process of learning allows for multilingualism. And there is some debate here about whether multilingualism and translanguaging is best done transgressively under the covers, or whether we need to bring it out into the open. And this might suggest, again, some further what ifs. What if glossaries of key vocabulary on a course were co-created online by students? And we know many of our online facilities now allow for creating glossaries. Why aren't we allowing this to happen in many different languages simultaneously? What if students were invited to select a piece of reading in their own language, to then run it through Google Translate, and to then share that with their colleagues? And what I would want to develop from that would be, first of all, a critique of the translation, and then possibly a discussion about why not all languages are as equal as each other in terms of Google Translate. What if writing tasks were designed to be multilingual? If we tolerated the silences, we perhaps tolerated the stammering that's been mentioned by Marco, where we don't understand, where we don't know what people are saying, but we're trying to infer the meaning. And so I'd like to just suggest that perhaps we start thinking about the different practical ways in which we can implement a sort of multilingualism in the classroom. On my last slide, you can see some of the work that's been coming out of linguistics in this area. And as well as thinking about multilingualism as content for learning and as process for learning, I would also want to think about it as product for learning. And by that I mean, what do our assessment practices tell us about our monolingual bias? Is there any way in which we can introduce multilingualism into the processes whereby we evaluate our students' work? So thank you. And I'll just get rid of my slides now.
Thank you very much, Gillian. That was, I'm sure many people here will have found that extremely interesting and helpful. You've talked about multilingualism by design, so that was great. We're coming up to 3:20. I would like to offer people a short comfort break, just for about 3 minutes, and then we will reconvene. I have received around 3 or 4 questions, and I'm sure that you will have other questions, and then we'll take some questions and for the panel. So perhaps if we could reconvene, yes, in about 3 or 4 minutes at 3:22. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. Gillian or Lynn, yes, I just wanted to see if we could remove the slide. That's great. And we've had a number of questions. The first question is from Harold Legaspi, and he has a question relating to the implementation of Indigenous languages. And I think that this was a question that related to Oka's presentation. And he asks, when implementing Indigenous languages, what are the political challenges, or what, if that's the right way of expressing it, what are some of the political issues involved?
If I may.
Please do.
Thank you. I think the topic of indigenizing the university as well as decolonizing the university as a framework is really important to read up on here. I think that the colonial history of schools, particularly in places where settler colonialism is still very prevalent, like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, has been a history of forced schooling and forced kidnapping of children, teaching them English and making them forget their indigenous languages, right? So I think a big political challenge, not really challenge, but an urgency, if you will, cultural urgency, is to acknowledge these wrongs and to really make people understand and students understand, because we live in this world where we cannot pretend that universities aren't part of colonial machinery anymore, and we need to acknowledge these histories. So I think teaching students that in classes is a really a fruitful way of understanding the push towards indigenizing universities in places of settler colonialism.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So from what I've understood, the raising awareness, the making visible is important. Thank you. Okay, we have another question. This question relates to the Romani people in Finland. So it's a very specialist question. And I think that the question was from Lena Robertson. And she asks, I'm assuming to Ila, what do you think about Romani? It's the Romani people are an official minority. It's an official minority language in Finland, but doesn't seem to be addressed in language policy, and as a consequence, the Romani people remain visible. Do you have any experience or expertise to share?
I could say something about that. It actually relates with the same that Marokka was just saying about the indigenous languages as well, because both Roma and Sami languages in Finland, along with both Finnish and Swedish sign languages, minority, like official minority languages in Finland. So they have different kind of position, meaning that it's kind of like in the level of law, it's right to maintain their language and culture and get support to there. But like to look their role at the higher education, all of those, specifically Roma and Sami languages, I mean, it's non-existent, and I haven't seen any discussion about that either. It may be also, it's more like it's very relevant current talk right now, the discussion going on in the primary and secondary level, sometimes in the high school as well. But and this regards with the Sami language more than Roma language. And I think Roma language in general, not only in Finland, but all over in Europe is the group that is very much discriminated and invisible in all of the spheres of the society. So it's not, I don't see that it would be specifically Finnish question, it's a European question and in all levels of the society, but it really shows also the hierarchization of language and the power of who and to whom, who is designing the services or who is, you know, paying attention to what and in behalf of who. I think that is very important question to keep in mind, but no, I haven't seen that kind of discussion going on with regards to higher education.
Thank you so much. And I think that the question and your extended response, Ila, points to the complexity of bringing in students and tutors' linguistic repertoire into the academy, but a useful discussion to have. Thank you so much. Another question we had from Anna Souza, which is, how can the decolonization of the multilingual university have an impact on journals reviewing processes and standards and procedures? So I think this question perhaps relates not so much to the teaching of students or to the making visible of multilingual repertoires in our classroom, but to academic practices more generally, and in particular to the kind of tacit practices around the peer review process. So I'm not sure who would like to respond about multilingual universities and how multilingualism can or should impact on peer review. So I'll throw that open to the panel.
perhaps one day we'll just get rid of it.
What, the question or peer review?
No, not the peer. No, well, because it's nonsense. It's a bit like going back to what we're talking about. Sorry, I'm not being provocative, but it's like it's what Victoria, you were saying last week. Because we've got these sort of rigid rules, they immediately discriminate. I was talking to a colleague this morning who was saying about something else quite complicated. He said, but if I look at the rules, the criteria that I'm going towards to get to where I want to go, I can't do that. It's not possible. So that's why it's almost having to really go right down, in fact, rather than the peer review journal, to the briefs that we write. They're all in English. Or we asked this classic thing of writing them in plain English, and it's like, what's that? And it's I almost sort of go, what do you mean by that? So that's why I'm really interested in the ideas of translation, and that's probably what I got into, where it becomes quite an interesting space where it becomes a slightly more democratic space when English is not seen as the predominant language. But I don't know. Sorry, maybe being a bit silly, but all those sort of journals that are highly peer reviewed that we all probably have to put in for, I'm sorry, I find them slightly tedious, really. And I think we should just start new things and get rid of those stuff, and they can go off there in their little dusty corners.
I mean, it's interesting because I know that there are some journals which allow for abstracts in other languages, but I think that many of you today, Gillian, Ela in particular, have talked about other practices which could be brought into to the peer review process. I suppose the question is perhaps for editorial boards of particular journal papers. Thank you for your response.
Can I just add to that as well, that I think if we are serious about this, then we need to think about, if work is going to be published in English, then what, are we insisting on British and American standard varieties, or are we allowing for varieties of English globally? That's one question. Another question, and I know someone's posted in the chat the interesting work that Teresa Lillis and colleagues have done, for example, on literacy brokers, which is, should we be much more overt about this translation problem, in terms of the fact that quite often people get their work edited, but it's all done under the counter, and we're all afraid to admit that it's happening, but people are still doing it. Why can't we just simply be more open about the fact that if you want to publish in a journal in another language, then it might be that we should all be honest. If you think you're going to have to do it in the standard variety of that language, that you then get somebody to help you do it. It seems to me that this relates, in addition to the sort of issue of editing and plagiarism, that where's the boundary between plagiarism and proofreading, which is the terrible old chestnut that we all have great difficulty with. But we know that many students are getting their work professionally edited, at advanced levels. And why can't we simply be open and honest about this and see this as one more what can we say, one more practice which we associate with multilingualism and varied discourses. Anyway, that's my penny's worth.
Can I just add to that, and also stray away from the question even further by just reiterating this idea of the plurilingual classroom. Because I feel there's a one of the shibboleths in university is there's a kind of fear of multilingual spaces, and it's structurally kind of mitigated against that. It will all be carried out via the language monitoring power of the leading tutor. But actually what would happen to introduce multiple languages, glossaries, as Gillian was talking about, some of those very, very practical, simple, easy mechanisms, is that they would disrupt this monolingual hegemony that is kept in place really through lots of unconscious and habitual mechanisms. But there's a surprising amount of fear around changing those. And I think we only need some either good practice interventions or some mandatory agreed experiments in some courses and curricula to do this. And we would very quickly see a different dynamic in the involvement and the contribution of international students. And it's an endemic problem that really shouldn't persist.
I think you've raised some really interesting, important, powerful points there, Tim. You know, I've observed in my relatively short time at the University of the Arts, and I would say that tutors have the power to effect change, even though they may perhaps perceive themselves as being monolingual or English dominant. And I've observed that in spaces in very difficult times where tutors have given the space over to small groups of international students, engaged in inclusive practices such as deep listening, what the sorts of things you're talking about do occur. And I appreciate and understand that if you are an English only or an English dominant user of English, that the idea that students are engaging in and working in languages that you may not be familiar with is disruptive, it is uncomfortable, and it is indeed radical. Yet, I think as Li Wei and other scholars have said, this notion of translingual, using different languages in the classroom and rethinking the university as a multilingual space really demands a different kind of tutor, one who co-learns with their students. And we have some examples of that already. Thank you.
If I may, sort of piggybacking on what Dr. Gillian Lazar was saying about, the fact that yes, there is widespread, help being given in terms of editing at advanced levels of writing and what you might call advanced. I would also like to say that this idea that students have to conform is very much a part of that push towards, I have to hire an editor so that my Singlish, for instance, Singaporean English, which I know won't be accepted, will be transmuted into, standard British English or American English or what have you. And I think this is a really key opportunity in terms of that transparency to get students to, as we're trying to do at Shadow Heroes, think critically about translation as a practice and think critically about editing as a practice, and how, biases and racisms and various forms of editing are a form of colonization in and of themselves, right? And I also just want to bring up one more thing, which is the importance of not knowing that was mentioned is so deeply fundamental. I think my colleague Jeremy Tiang is a translator, and he says, the truth is, nothing is able to be translated. We're all just trying our best, right? There's no one word that can be translated in a one-to-one, really. That's a very colonial understanding of translation, right? And I think it's a really key opportunity in terms of discussing a multilingual university to continue to have these philosophical discussions about translation and what it actually means. And there have been panels that I've been aware of Indigenous language practitioners saying, we don't actually want our languages to be translated. So there's the right of refusal as well. And I think we have to understand that translating into English is also a form of exposure, right, to quote unquote global capital or the neoliberal system. And that it's not always a good thing, especially for Indigenous communities and Indigenous students. And I think, we have a right to maintain that sense of insider knowledge.
And Karani, I'd just like to say thank you very much for pointing that out, because I think this is one of the issues if we're suggesting classroom strategies, as I was doing, is that, there's some very interesting work coming out of South Africa, which has, very much, because there's a policy of 11 official languages, people are very much wanting to encourage multilingualism in the classroom, which is happening with students anyway. And there's some very interesting research about how concept understanding is being developed greatly by drawing on other languages and other linguistic resources. But simultaneously, is there a case for saying that these processes of translanguaging are often a way of redressing injustice by staying under the covers, by staying transgressive, by staying not being co-opted? And so, it's a very, very tricky and delicate balance. And I think the point you've made about the right to refuse and the right to not participate in these processes, casts another sort of light on the whole thing.
Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, Oka. And I think that the issue of refusal, the right to refuse, I think resonates with discourses around student silence or feeling silenced in the classroom as well. I'd like to take another question. This is from Yasmina. Yasmina says, thank you for this fascinating discussion on language and decolonization. The statement by Mark that we do not possess a mother tongue or that there is no such thing as mother tongue resonated with me. I was particularly drawn to the idea of language stuttering. I'm a multilingual poet of mixed heritage, Croatian, Algerian, from London, writing in English, French, and Croatian. And the question is, I'm wondering how the speakers present in this panel would define the multilingual. And a sub-question, to what extent do they think multilingual writing practice is able to subvert dominant discourses of monolingualism and monolingual paradigms?
Well, I suppose one of the issues in trying to define multilingualism is, how do we define language? How do we define a language? And we all know that the description of what a language is and how bounded it is in and of itself quite often a political decision. You know, there have been many points in human history where language has decided to become a language because it's, for example, connected with the nation state. So I think, you know, some of what our understanding of language and multilingualism is about has been colored by those kind of discourses. But if we accept that there are different languages, then I suppose for me, a multilingual is somebody who is able to shift between different languages, but may be quite uneven in the repertoires that they're able to use in each language. So, for example, one language might be used for one purpose, another language might be used for another. Literacy or religious belief might be connected with one particular language and not another. In other words, I think it's a very, very complex identity, in that it's you know, the notion that there's equality of language use in all ways is just not the case for me. And that's what makes it so interesting. And that's what gives somebody so many different semiotic resources. And the other thing I'd like to say, and I don't quite know how one would define this from a linguistic perspective, but even if somebody is technically a monoglot in one language only, they are still using many, many different registers within that language. And they might be shifting. You know, in London, we see around us people who are moving from what I would call, I suppose, London vernacular with friends and family to what we might call posher discourses. Again, ethnographers have written about all of this. Do we talk about those as different languages? Or I suppose from a linguistic perspective, we have to talk about them as different registers, but they are simply people engaging in using all the different linguistic resources they have available to them. And possibly we could even extend that to think about visual resources or the other kinds of resources, for example, that, you know, Mark has mentioned in talking. Anyway, I don't know what other people think a multilingual is, but that would be my thoughts about it.
Thank you, Gillian. Ela, did you want to speak?
Yeah, I very much agree on the definition, what you said, Gillian. It sounded what I wanted to say as well. Just to add there, I think that it also includes the ability to be able to navigate in these kind of multilingual environments. And I would see that, yeah, like professional language is already something, nobody talks academic before coming to university. So it's something that we share. We need to learn that together, so to say, not only those ones who are not speaking English once they come to English-speaking university. Another point, what I want to, it actually relates both to this question and the earlier one, that we very easily, this question of language is individualized, and also that we need to, like that we, you know, we need to tolerate more openly these kind of, but it is also a political question. Like, for example, I've been organizing several congresses that we have tried to kind of encourage the multilingual repertoires there. But then the people come, okay, if I want as many people as possible be able to hear my presentation. So they choose themselves that they choose English, even though there would be other opportunities as well, including their mother tongue, to put it so. And as well, that writing in English is just the only, like, for example, looking from Finnish perspectives, like if I'm looking for a position at the university, whatever I have written in Finnish, it doesn't count. I mean, I have to have English speaker journal, you know, English articles in English published in certain journals. So it's not my choice. Oh, of course it is, but it has consequences. So it's also very importantly a political issue, that to what extent this kind of multilingualism or the open use of different kind of types of languages is actually accepted, and not only accepted, but also taking seriously as a professional input and not just something that is, you know, we allow to do. And I think the first speaker of today, Alexander Ding, may have something interesting to say on that, as far as I understood your what you are doing in your work.
Well, there's an invitation, Alex. Would you like to respond?
My problem is I'm about 10 minutes behind everyone. So by the time I've thought of something, it's moved on. But what struck me is we talk a lot about linguistic repertoires and various options and so on. But what I'm also concerned about are things like basic material economic access. So to have a dichotomy, for example, between L1 and L2 publications. So, you know, there are numerous articles which explore the challenges for L2 academics to publish in English, etc., etc. But there are fine-grained differences between, to put it bluntly, economic power. So, you know, within the abilities to publish, it does depend on money. It depends on status, not just distance from English in terms of the complexity of publishing. And I think sometimes we've got a tendency to forget that material conditions, also economic conditions, play a major part in this. They're intertwined. You can't have, for me, you can't have social justice without economic justice. They're not distinct. And the other thing I noticed is that we used earlier on fairly casually the label international student, which is a financial term. Otherwise it means nothing. It's everyone except for. So I'm not terribly sure that those kind of labels are helpful either.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I don't think they are helpful. Yeah. You know, I was also, I'm also slightly troubled by the term, increasingly troubled by the concept of super diversity. It's very useful for describing, I think, for describing the Western condition, Western cities. But I think super diversity, diversity within diversity, perhaps hides and flattens the hierarchies, which I think, you know, you're alluding to, and so does some of the speakers. I would like to take another question. I hope I haven't lost it in the chat. The question is from the question is from Noor, and Noor says that they are researching constructing othering through lived experiences. They're lately interested in identity of first-generation Algerian students in the UK. This is in the chat. As Arabic language teachers, as Arabic language teaching follow these students, I've become aware of how the education that they receive is failing to acknowledge the darkened colonial heritage of British and other European countries, which makes me wonder about the content of the curriculum that's based on nationalist discourses rather than a critical study of the past in order to move forward. What are your thoughts in this regard? So this seems to be a question around decolonization, representation of the other. Would anyone like to comment?
well, I can start if that encourages some others to jump in, but I think that is a real problem. Like there have been recently several, even in Finnish context, several PhDs looking the representations in different, like for example, biology and geography books and history books of how other than European countries and nations are presented there and visualized there, how much they are talked about and in what ways they are talked about. And it's quite shocking to recognize, to really bring that forth, that it's still like clearly made the other, the passive one, which is the rural one also, and also like there's no mention of what kind of role of let's say Finland, let alone all the other countries in Europe have had in the history. So what kind of common histories we actually do have.
Thank you. Okay.
I think it's a really important question, and I fully agree. I think that this is an opportunity to visualize our, to understand our students as not only learning from the university context, of course, but also to highlight the importance of communities and elders and what they can bring to the lives of students, and to not have that curriculum be co-opted by a university setting, but to understand these parallel educations and as a really subversive way of showing that, where university educations are inadequate and are colonial, are racist, I think that it's really important to honor different modes of learning and different communities of learning that students are also a part of, because I think that universities and teachers can do a lot. Tutors, as Victoria has said, can do a lot, but there's also the family environment that students who may have been, raised in colonial education grow up in, right? And how can we actively tackle that to understand that they're growing up in families where this colonial history is just passed down, and that affects how they interact with other students. So just to open up spheres of what we're dealing with.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question?
Please.
I just thinking about the nature of our students who pay £9,000 a year, and thinking about the fact that 1 in 7 students study in a business school. A great number of what we label for fee-paying purposes, international students come to Leeds, for example, to study engineering, business, law, very vocational courses. And they often come from political contexts which are problematic, shall we say, different. Thinking of China, Saudi Arabia. And the context of this discussion, how does that brush up against or how does that meet those kind of realities? We talk about decolonizing, and yet we have a university system which is around commodification of education and has these kind of cohorts. Would you anticipate the kind of decolonizing process as being disruptive of that, or do you see it as being separate? How do we see that within that context? We ignore it and carry on. I don't know.
Yeah, I think if I can just say one thing, I think the function of the university in terms of a private ethic, which is measured by the benefit for individual students in terms of outcomes and career prospects and so on, employment, limits universities and in effect destabilizes universities, I think, from taking their public ethic function seriously, because public ethic function, and there's been a thread through these discussions of the creation of community and the creation of what language facilitates, which is actually connection and community, and how that expands outward from an educational context into social world and the international social world. But unless universities take the public good as being part of their mission and identity, then there isn't a motivation there that's explicit. I mean, universities are often explicit about their values, but not about their ethics. And that obligation there, the ethics of obligation, the ethics of contribution, and Marginson writes really well about this, about the wider benefits of a university education, I think can be seen as part of the background of this context, but also part of the way that university policies and strategies do not articulate themselves clearly enough, and I think have rested on the economic value of the international fee-paying student, and been fairly silent about its obligations, but not just for that cohort, but in the wider sense of the university's mission.
Thank you, Tim. Would anyone else like to respond? Mark.
This is going to be, sorry, this is going to be sounding a little bit awkward, but I'm going to go right back, like Alexandra was saying 10 minutes ago, which I thought was I'm slightly agitated by something, which is this idea of language, linguistics being somewhere here. And then we talked about the visual, something that we might want to be able to talk about. And it's not a criticism, Gillian, but it's just like I spent 30 years trying to get images into academic essays. You know, now it doesn't, nobody cares. I spent a very long time getting images from the bottom of the essay at the end, because that's the way you put them, because that's what you do in art history, to move them actually into the text, to a point where, why do we need the words anyway? You know, what? And so I'm almost trying to think of a place where we don't speak. I mean, I've got loads of stories where I've communicated better with someone who I'm not speaking in that language, spoke to. Whereas, and other people I just haven't been able to understand what they're saying, even though I understand exactly all the words they're saying. I don't know. So I know that. Sorry, Tim, that was taking the idea of ethics, but I just thought actually the idea of visual being somewhere else is a little bit disturbing for a sculptor who's been making art for 40 years, and it's quite interesting. We're in the University of Arts London, and I'm just wondering whether we can that whole language idea is, perhaps that's what I'm trying to say in my presentation, was actually, hold on a minute, are we doing the supremacy of language itself is possibly an issue? Anyway, sorry Tim, I didn't want to.
I think that's a really good point, and I think I expressed myself very, very clumsily actually, because what I actually think is that, there's a lot of talk about multimodality now in learning. And I know Victoria's talked about the sort of dominance of the SAS tradition. And I suppose what I was trying to say rather clumsily is, if we're moving towards multilingualism, why aren't we moving very much towards multimodality? And obviously in the University of the Arts, that's central. But for many of us in disciplines that are not art related, we don't recognize that yet. We're still making people write essays in one language in standard English. Sorry, I don't know if that's...
Thank you, Gillian. We have just a minute or two left. It's been a very enriching, very fascinating discussion. I just wanted to very quickly respond to Alex's question around international students and so forth. And perhaps it's been said before, and it may be quite a glib response, but I think that one way that we can engage in some of the discomfort around other countries, other ways of doing things, is perhaps to move beyond the boundaries now. And I think it's quite appropriate that we end with a discussion of the boundaries between, or the false boundaries between the written, academic writtenness and the visual essay. And I think that's true of the labels that are so prominent and essentializing in the institution, whether we refer to speakers as native or non-native or so forth. So I think once we can begin to look and think and see creatively around language and multilingualism, some of those boundaries, such as the international, begin to dissolve. It's 2 minutes to 4 o'clock, so I think I'm going to close the roundtable. It's been absolutely fantastic, and I would like to thank everybody so much for your contributions and for your questions, but a special thank you to Alex, Oka, Ela, Mark, Tim and Gillian. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you for the audience. Thank you for your participation as well.